Today, I'm flattening the top of my workbench. Now this workbench is actually my dad's old workbench. It's the one that I grew up with using tools on for many, many years, so I'm excited to flatten it, refinish it, and put it to use in my shop. You want to go ahead and flatten your workbench when it makes sense, when you notice that it's becoming a problem, or if you've got an old bench top like mine, or you just have a little bit of extra time. I use my workbench for everything from hand planing and power tools to assemblies and glue ups and even for finishing. So my workbench gets a ton of use, and being flat is critical, especially for the hand planing, the assembly process. Having a flat reference surface is absolutely essential for that. So I like to go ahead and check the workbench when I feel like it's becoming a problem, or I notice that it's really out of flat or just needs a little bit of extra love. Now's a good time to flatten it. There's a few different ways that you can go ahead and flatten a workbench, but I find the fastest and easiest is going to be using a jointer plane. This is a number 7 from Lie-Nielsen. Anything that gives you a lot of length to flatten boards is going to flatten your workbench really well. I'm also going to be using sander for some of the final finish. Once I go ahead and use the hand plane, I'll probably just run a sander across it a little bit, smooth it up. I hope to not have to use a jack plane. I hope that it's not too out of flat, but if I do, I've got something that'll quickly remove more material to help me with the process. This old workbench top has some paint and some finish splattered across it, and I definitely use my bench for finishing, so I get that stuff all over it all the time. So what I'm going to do first is actually pull out a sander with some really coarse paper just to remove some of that finish. That stuff is really hard and can quickly dull your plane blades or even get little nicks in them. It's much harder than the wood beneath. So to save myself a couple of sharpenings, I'm going to go ahead and run some coarse sandpaper first. As I mentioned, this is my dad's old workbench, so I don't currently have a base for it. So I've just gone ahead and secured it down to my workbench for working on the top. First, you obviously want to remove any hardware that's on your bench. I started with a 6-inch sander with a 50 grit paper, but this wasn't removing material fast enough. So I moved over to the Festool Rotex in Rotex mode with a 60 grit paper, and this really dug through all the paint and varnish spills. Now the whole point of that quick sanding was to save myself hopefully a little bit of sharpening on my hand plane, and I think I probably did that. I spent just 5 minutes quickly sanding some of the bigger spills and paint off of here, and now I'm going to move on to hand planing. What I've done is taken my straight edge to find out where I need to concentrate my efforts on this workbench top. And I found by moving my straight edge up and down that there's a hump right down the middle of this workbench. So I'm going to spend the first amount of time working on the middle of the workbench to bring that more level with the edges, and then I'll go diagonal to diagonal, keep checking as I go with my straight edge, and finally end to end to basically smooth things up. I did end up using my jack plane with a tooth blade, which more quickly removes material from the center of the workbench. Okay, we're definitely getting there. I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the jointer plane, take some long passes, and see where we are. Now you can sort of see here in this main section that I've got good diagonals going both directions. Went planing this way across and then planing this way, and I was definitely catching wood, not full length shavings each way, but catching wood all the way along to get a nice crisscross. So this whole area is now relatively flat. Just a few more passes with the jointer plane to finish up. I'm now calling this bench top as flat as I'm going to make it at this point. I've taken my hand planes and went across the grain to remove high spots. Then I went diagonally, and I also went with the grain to make sure everything was flat. What I used to make sure it was flat was a straight edge. This is about 3 foot straight edge, and I would constantly check across and diagonally as I went along. Make sure to remove the high spots first and then slowly incorporate larger and larger areas. Now, when I tilt this and look for light underneath, there's definitely light gaps sort of all the way along, but they're very minor and they're very consistent little ridges all the way along from my hand planes. Maybe, you know, a few thousandths up to 5 thousandths or more. I didn't take any feeler gauges and look, but to me, it's very flat along at least 3-foot sections here, all the way up and down, cross grain and diagonally and straight. So I'm very happy with that. Now there is a section here which was the front edge that you'll notice is not nice and clean wood like the rest of the top. And this is a piece that does dip. It was the front edge of a workbench that honestly probably hasn't been flattened in decades. And it dips maybe, I want to say about 1/16 of an inch or so. And I felt like I didn't want to remove that much material from the whole top and worry about this leading edge. Just wasn't worth the time and effort to me. I'm actually going to flip this around. I'm going to use the other end as the front, and I'll know that this back edge has a little bit of a dip to it. So the point is putting the effort that you want to into flattening your bench. For me, it was fine to leave this section not quite as flat. Just decide how flat is good enough for you for the work that you're doing. Now that I've got my bench top flat, the question is what else to do to this, if anything. Any sanding, smooth planing, and then of course putting it on some kind of finish. So for me, let me address the first question. I am going to do a little bit of sanding to this just to remove some of those hand plane marks. It's definitely overkill. Definitely don't have to do it. I'm not going to change any of the flatness. I'm just going to remove some of the hand plane ridges just so I think it looks a little better. It's going to take me 5 or 10 minutes. While I have it in this state, I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I took about 15 minutes and worked my way through a 50 grit, 80 grit, and 120 grit. I didn't worry about getting rid of all the hand planing marks, although I got rid of about 80% of them, and I didn't worry about getting rid of all the scratches from the previous grit. This is a workbench top. I don't really care about that. Speaking of grits, definitely don't go higher than 120. You don't want this to be too smooth. You don't want your workbench to be really slick. You want it to be a little bit grippy. And also, speaking of hand planing, hand plane marks definitely have a lot of tear out throughout the top of this workbench, and I just don't care. I went any direction that was the easiest for me to hand plane. All these strips have grain running in different directions, so it's really pretty impossible to control that without taking a lot of effort. And I just don't really care, being that it's my workbench. Now that I have it here and it's looking really beautiful, do I want to add finish or not? And this really, to me, depends on how I'm going to be using this workbench. If I was going to be using it for just power tools, hand tools, joinery, if I wasn't going to do finishing or glue ups or assembly on here, I think I might leave it just like this with no finish. It's definitely easier to maintain. You can quickly sand it, scrape it, hand plane it, and not have to worry about a finish. And also, I think it's going to look better over time because all the scrapes, dents, and dings and scratches that you get on this, you won't really notice on a raw wood. It's just going to add some character, whereas on a finish, you're definitely going to see that a little bit more. However, I'm using this as an all-around workbench. I'll be doing a lot of assembly on here, finish work, glue ups. There's going to be a lot of different things being spilled onto this workbench. So I am actually going to apply a little bit of a finish here just to help with the cleanup every time that I spill something on here. So the question is what type of finish to put on this workbench. If I use a film finish like a varnish, polyurethane, shellac that builds up a film above the wood, that's going to give great protection for anything that I spill on it. However, those finishes leave quite a slick surface, which is what I don't want on my workbench. However, if I use a penetrating oil that penetrates in and fills the pore, that will help repel glue or other finishes I spill on here, not quite as well, but it won't leave a very slick surface. I can rough it up pretty easily. Being practical, I'm going to use what I have left over, which is some water locks. And this is a very thin oil varnish mix, so it's going to give me some of both. It's definitely going to penetrate in. I'm going to use just one coat to allow it to really penetrate, and then I'm going to completely wipe it off to leave the thinnest possible film on top. I've let the water locks dry overnight, and now I'm just grabbing some 100 grit paper and just by hand gonna rough up the top a little bit And in case any of that varnish dried on top, this will help just cut through that slick surface and leave behind a nice grippy surface for working on. The nice thing about this oil finish is over time, if I want to repair spots that are dinged up or whatever, or go ahead and sand or hand plane a little bit to flatten this back out, it's easy to just throw on some more oil and fix those spots, or just recoat the whole thing and really freshen it back up. Now you may have noticed this front edge of the bench was all kind of beat up as well. And I didn't really do anything to it. The only thing I did do was took my Rotex sander with a really coarse grit and just knock off all the grime that had sort of built up along the front. I do clamp things to the front of my bench, and I didn't want any big chunks of grit or paint or varnish or anything that was on the front to mar my work when I went ahead and clamped it to the front. The only other thing I would consider doing to this front edge is making sure that it's 90 to the top. It's useful at times when you're clamping things to the front to know that that reference surface here on the front is 90 to the top of your bench. I haven't done it yet for my bench. It's not a big deal, but that's one thing that you might want to think about. After just a couple of hours of work, I've really renewed my dad's old bench, and I'm super excited to put this to use in my shop. Now I just need to build a base for it, and I'm ready to go.